Famously, the British weather is a national obsession.
Could you give me a wind speed and direction, please?
5 gusting 7 from the west.
For some, it provides vital information for the day ahead.
40s, chromatin 4.
For millions of others, the forecast is a little piece of prediction that can make us smile
Oh dear, let's do it again.
or frown.
She heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
This is Britain. This is what we normally call bad weather.
Forecasting the weather is complicated. It may never be possible to make perfect predictions.
It doesn't comb its hair and polish its shoes, it doesn't do what it's supposed to. British weather is very complicated.
The weather never stands still, you know.
No, I don't suppose it does.
This is the story of the weather itself, and about some of the people who forecast it,
Well, that's the forecast.
and those who depend on it.
Expected over the British Isles at noon tomorrow.
Now here's a gale warning. Attention all shipping. The Met Office issued the following gale warning to shipping at 0450 GMT today.
There have been weather forecasts since the earliest days of broadcasting. The shipping forecast began on radio in 1924.
The gale is likely to be severe on the southwest coasts and in the English Channel.
Followed in 1936 by the first television forecasts, a disembodied hand drawing isobars on a map. But the next major advance in presenting the weather was not brought about by new broadcasting technology. It was the weather itself that made it happen.
Western and northern districts during the afternoon and evening.
Several key weather events at the beginning of the 1950s soaked into the national psyche. The Lynmouth flood disaster of 1952 took 34 lives and devastated a Devon community.
The great storm swept away all our boats, and as we watched further, we saw a row of cottages near the river and the flashes of lightning, because it was dark by this time. In the flashes of lightning, we saw these houses fold up like a pack of cards. We swept out with the river amid the agonizing screams of some of the local inhabitants, that I knew very well.
It began to be asked if the damage could have been prevented. The following year, 3 million people attending the Queen's coronation got a right royal soaking, something they could have been better prepared for with a little forewarning.
Then it started to rain. But the thousands didn't give in. Somehow the wet and the cold made them even more determined to stay on, to hold on to the places they had so diligently sought out. And the lines of newcomers never stopped. They all made the best of it. Up went the umbrellas, on went the raincoats, and under the shelter of blankets and newspapers, they stuck it out.
And most devastating of all, that same year, a freak storm tide hit the east coast of England, resulting in some of the worst flooding the country has ever seen.
January 31st this year, the east coast of England. The seawall was breached in over 1,000 places from the East Riding right down to Kent. More than 20,000 houses were flooded. The total cost of the damage, about £50 million.
More than 300 people died. There was thousands of homes destroyed because of the weather, and no one really saw it coming, or they didn't see it coming in time, because as places were getting flooded on the east coast, the phone lines were down, so no one could even ring ahead to people further down the coast and say, there's a big storm coming, you want to get out.
But very soon the whole nation was asking one question.
In the face of growing criticism, the BBC responded with the help of the Met Office. Televisions were now part of life. 20 million viewers had tuned in to watch the coronation. It was the ideal medium for weather forecasts, but they needed to be more engaging. What the weather needed was a face. Someone to tell the audience night after night what the weather was going to do the next day. In 1954, a year before the first news presenters appeared on screen, the BBC appointed 32-year-old George Cowling from the Met Office as their first weather forecaster. At 7:55 p.m. on Monday, January the 11th, 1954, Cowling prepared for his debut live broadcast. As a Met Office man, he had to travel across London to the Lime Grove studios with a large bundle of rolled-up weather charts that he'd drawn himself. With a long 5 minutes to fill, Cowling decided to ad-lib a little. Something which didn't go down too well with the Met Office.
I think George Cowling got into a little bit of hot water when he ended it by saying that tomorrow would be a good day to hang out the washing. Now, nothing like this had ever been said on British TV before.
It went down a storm with the national press, but that didn't impress his employer.
He was rebuked by the Met Office for stepping outside his brief. He was not doing what he was tasked to do, which was simply to give a synoptic picture of the weather over the next few hours.
Cowling was not the first meteorologist to feel the wrath of the Met Office. Founded in 1854 by the Board of Trade, it was an organisation that prided itself on its scientific credentials.
Its first director was Robert Fitzroy, who was already famous. He'd come back from the voyage of the Beagle. He was Darwin's ship's commander on the Beagle. But he'd always been interested in weather.
He felt that if you had a network of observers stationed around the coasts, that you could track what we would now call weather systems coming on the way. And he was right.
Fitzroy began to imagine that he could offer public weather forecast. And in 1861, he issued the first newspaper weather forecast, which, as it happens, was correct. This was 1st of August, 1861, and he said, it's very short, bulletin, very vague, but he said there'd be a moderate westerly wind and it would be fine. And he was absolutely right. Now, in some ways, in retrospect, he should have stopped there.
But Fitzroy didn't stop there. He continued issuing unauthorised newspaper forecasts, which were wrong more often than they were right.
They were hopelessly inaccurate. He didn't have enough observers, he didn't have enough data, and he sort of rushed it.
Fitzroy tried to limit the damage of getting weather predictions wrong by inventing the term weather forecast. He hoped this emphasised that he was dealing in probabilities and not hard facts. But for the Victorians, inaccurate weather forecasts were too much like the black art of prophecy. The newspaper weather forecasts were discontinued, and Fitzroy's reputation was in tatters.
Pressures of work combined with this very public rebuke and an underlying depressive illness led to his suicide in 1865. And the investigation into that suicide was a huge story. It was almost the Victorian equivalent of the death of David Kelly.
Fitzroy's death cast a shadow over weather forecasting. There were no more newspaper forecasts for another decade. And when they did begin again in 1875, the science of meteorology had begun a period of change that would revolutionise forecasting. The invention of isobars, which are lines of equal pressure drawn on weather maps, changed how weather was visualised. And in the 20th century, the introduction of wireless telegraphy made it easier to collect weather readings.
And this, for the first time, made it possible for data collected in different places to be delivered to a central organising point immediately. And this was the key to sort of scientific weather forecasting.
The science of meteorology continued to improve, and by the 1950s, more accurate weather readings meant more confident weather forecasts.
Well, the basis of our method is to look at the month of November that we've just had and then examine our records for the past 90 years to see if we can find a similar occasion. When we've located one, we look at the December which followed, and this gives us one clue for the coming month.
The Met Office was at the cutting edge of forecasting.
An associated trough of low pressure will later move southeast across Scotland into Northern Ireland and England.
And it was the obvious body to supply the BBC with weather forecasts and the meteorologists to present them. Each one facing the daily challenge of correctly predicting what the weather will do and broadcasting that to the public.
The cloud will soon start to thicken, and then the rain, which is already over Northern Ireland, will move eastwards into western Scotland and northwest England, and then into remaining western.
And for some, knowing with any certainty what the weather is about to do would make life much easier.
Tomorrow I'm getting married. And I'm really, really hoping for good weather, but can't really guarantee anything. I have been planning this wedding for a year, so it's a long time in the making. We've been checking the weather all week. Everything stops for the weather forecast, really. Everyone has to be quiet, you know, no one answers the phone. You just kind of sit there and take it all in. It looks like it's kind of a mixture of rain and sun, which kind of isn't that bad, but it depends when it rains, I guess. My mum has been quite neurotic about the weather for the weekend. She has been sort of checking it at every opportunity. Yeah, she's been a little bit over the top about it.
At the moment I can see the sun breaking through here, which is lovely, casting some lovely shadows. A gentle breeze, the weeping willow is just moving beautifully. And it does make a difference, but the wedding will go ahead. Come rain, come shine.
Last night the weather took a turn for the worst. There was a massive clap of thunder, a flash of lightning, and I was really, really scared. Because I just was like, oh, it's my wedding tomorrow, and I could just hear the rain pouring down. At the moment, it doesn't look too bad, but it's that kind of weather that's sort of threatening to rain a bit, so it could go either way.
Is it too early?
Hey. I was prepared for rain, so it was the nicest surprise ever to have the sun on the big day.
I don't know, but like you said, congratulations.
To be able to look out of the windows where we were being married and just see the lakes and the grass and the gardens in such beautiful sunlight, so it was amazing.
This is BBC Television.
The wind was so cold that the sea froze on the Essex coast.
The weather forecasters did not have much good news to impart at the beginning of the 1960s.
By the time this blizzard had finally blown itself out, 200 main roads were impassable and 95,000 miles of road were snowbound.
The big freeze of 1962-63 lasted 3 months and was the coldest winter since 1740.
After 5 days battling, milk roundsmen had to take the day off from exhaustion, and 15,000 London housewives went without milk.
A new face was introduced to the weather lineup at the end of this cold snap.
Hello there. And if you got wet today, well, you were decidedly unlucky.
Bert Ford began his BBC career in 1963, delivering simple, instructive forecasts.
British Isles, but the cold front, fairly lethargic, quite slow moving eastwards, and it's going to take...
As a Met Office employee of 16 years standing, Bert Ford was more civil servant than television presenter.
Very much with us. just moving across southeastern district.
When the Met Office was founded in the 1850s, it was very much part of the military wing of government. Met Office employees are effectively MOD employees, and they hold ranks and pension arrangements equivalent to ranks and pension arrangements in the armed forces.
On this front, otherwise dry and fairly mild. And now over to the National Summary Chart.
By now, the weather maps were professionally produced, and the forecaster did not need his crayon. The weather was an established part of the television schedule, and complaints about the weather are part of the forecaster's life.
Hello, Weather Centre.
Well, Bert, I think it's the general opinion of most citizens that weather forecasting is not an exact science. Do people ring up and complain and threaten to sue and all the rest of it?
Well, yes, certainly. We would expect to have the complaint put back to us, and in fact, if only to explain the reason for the error.
This was a decade of mind-blowing changes in the science of the skies. Computers arrived at the Met Office, and now mathematical equations were used to make forecasts. It was computer-generated equations that enabled meteorologist Edward Lawrence to develop one of the big ideas of the 20th century: chaos theory, which says that weather is totally unpredictable.
The chaos theory as applied to weather, you know, a man stands on a stage, drops a golf ball, it lands in the same place, drops a piece of paper, it never lands in the same place, it flutters around, and the science of meteorology is the piece of paper.
Suddenly, forecasters had to accept the idea that any imperfections in their weather data, however small, would eventually lead to huge errors down the line.
Ultimately, what it meant is that no weather forecast can ever be perfect. Any error that we have in the initial conditions will always limit the accuracy of our forecast in the future. And that's popularly known as this idea of a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil causing a tornado in Texas.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
It wasn't the only new way of looking at the weather. The first weather satellites were launched, sending back images of the Earth's atmosphere with the weather visible in a new and exciting way.
That was really important to meteorologists to get this very large global overview of what was going on that they'd only been able to see by plotting things like maps with isobars or measurements from weather balloons to that point.
These images were a revelation. Suddenly, the entire world's weather was visible to the forecaster.
Since we've had satellites, no one has missed any tropical cyclones, any hurricanes over that period. So before, if a tropical cyclone didn't hit land, we weren't aware of it. If it didn't affect any shipping, we didn't know it existed. It's enabled us to do much more detailed study, and I suppose in a way the general public has perhaps been more aware of that global perspective as well.
The next of kin to the wayward wind.
A global perspective is one thing, but weather is a local business, and in Britain, rain is never far away. For decades, the umbrella has been an essential piece of kit. So perhaps it's surprising how little we value this humble piece of weatherproofing.
There will be some showers here and there developing. So far they've been occurring in western Scotland and parts of Ireland too, but they could occur in other districts.
At London Transport's Lost Property Office, umbrellas have been filling the shelves for decades.
If you've lost an individual item, you think there might be a few dozen, but we get on average between 1,100 to 1,300 items of property every day. And that's, 100 mobile phones every day, 300 books, bags, travel tickets every day. Last year we had just over 12,000 umbrellas came through to us.
Everyone that arrives here is labelled and stored in the vaults for 3 months waiting to be claimed.
When you have that spell of bad weather, it's really easy to tell. Within the space of a week, your umbrella stocks can go up by 1,000 quite easily. And you can almost relate that back to the week or 2 weeks where the weather was inclement.
Of the 12,000 umbrellas that arrive here annually, only about 300 are reunited with their original owners. The rest are sold or donated to charity.
You can pick sort of what season it is based on the type of property we have coming through. This summer was a perfect example. We had one of the largest heat waves that London has had in a long time. So we're preparing right now the beginning of autumn for the onslaught of the gloves.
By the 1970s, the weather forecast was in glorious technicolor.
Good afternoon. Well, for most parts of the country, it's another rather cold day with showers.
And Britain's first weather woman, Barbara Edwards, had arrived in front of the cameras.
With radio, one hasn't had to worry about what one's wearing. Nobody sees you. But of course, this is quite a change.
But you are giving your wardrobe some careful thought.
Oh, I certainly am, yes.
But her arrival was eclipsed by some other new kids on the block. The 70s saw an influx of new male weather forecasting talent. Amongst them were Bill Giles, Ian McCaskill,
Oh, hello, there you are.
and Michael Fish.
There we are, I think that'll hold now. Thank you very much, love.
They soon became household names. For though each of them had served for many years in the back rooms of the Met Office, they all took to screen life with relish.
Well, I've said the weather is very changeable, and one look at my weather chart will show you why.
Good evening. Well, a much quieter look to the weather now, especially after the gales of last night. And indeed, I think most places will probably have a fine and dry night, rather a chilly one. But there will be one or two showers coming through from time to time, chiefly in northwestern parts.
Between them, they had more front than the weather map.
Already, though, at the beginning...
And it was the weather map that was next in line for a makeover.
And as the day goes on, I think you're going to find these showers will tend to become heavier.
With zippy new magnetic symbols came some new technical challenges.
Fairly thundery with some, oh dear, these let's do it again.
What I think is likely to happen is that these frontal systems...
These frontmen of weather science appeared night after night on primetime television. Unsurprisingly, their jumpers, ties and facial hair became the stuff of everyday gossip.
People would tune into the BBC weather forecast to see what jumper Michael Fish was wearing. It seemed frivolous, you know, and it seemed a kind of jokey way of absolving yourself of the fact that your forecast wasn't always right. Though it doesn't matter because I'm a joker wearing a nice jumper.
But it was a weather event that really made them news. The devastating drought of 1976 seared the weather into the nation's consciousness.
This country is now in one of the worst periods of drought since records began 200 years ago.
Lasting from May until August, the drought put the country into a state of emergency. People needed the forecast in a way they never had before.
But the anticyclone there looks fairly well anchored now, and that's going to continue to keep the dry, warm weather running in southern parts of the country.
We all know that our taste in food depends upon the weather.
You're welcome.
For some, a long, hot summer is good for business. Luca's ice cream parlour in Musselburgh on the east coast of Scotland has been counting on good weather since 1908.
I watch the weather forecast every single morning before I come to my work. I'm up back at 6 in the morning, and that's the first thing I do. TV on, weather forecast, so that I have a rough idea what my day's going to be like and what uniforms and things we're going to need. And it gives us a rough idea of how busy we expect we're going to be. We can be in here for 9 hours and we never see the end of the queue till we're walking past it going home. But the queues are frightening, really frightening.
Luca's manufacture their own ice cream. Each 100-gallon batch contains milk, sugar, double cream and 25 kilograms of butter.
As far as flavours go, the latest trend is Nutella.
ice cream. We used to sell a lot of coffee, but for some reason nobody wants coffee ice cream now. Well, there's very little. And Nutella, mint chocolate chip, and we do another one called Toffee Fudgy Wudgy, which is probably one of our best sellers. Not to forget the sorbies. I brew sorbet. It's also a Scottish thing.
So at 9 o'clock this morning, I think the cloud will be in this position with just some little bits of fine rain, bit of sea fog, bit of cloud. 12 o'clock, looking like that. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sweltering hot with some patchy cloud. 6 o'clock, an isolated thunderstorm, as there was yesterday.
Pump up the volume, pump up the volume, pump up the volume, dance, dance.
Into the 1980s, television forecasts embraced the computer age.
Now it's time to get the mouse out of its cage, and this is the mouse. It's a piece of equipment which allows me to move a pointer around the screen and select any piece of information I want to and put it anywhere on my map.
It was also the decade that saw the final erosion of any barrier between the forecasters and their audience.
Yeah, and here they come now. Wet, windy, and a deep depression over the eastern.
By now, they were public property.
So there was suddenly this flowering of people coming out from their little niches in their little boxes.
Singing in the rain.
You suddenly thought, actually, what, the humans? They've got legs, they're not just from the waist up after all.
The weather forecasters had become so big, they even inspired some tribute acts.
Hello. Yes. What? Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be very nippy. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Want to wrap up warm. Yeah. Yeah. Plenty of woolies. Yeah. You can't be too. I say you can't be too careful. Yeah. Well, it's getting colder these days, don't you think? Oh, much colder. Yes. Well, bye-bye. Yeah.
Weatherman Ketley is a weatherman, a weatherman, a weatherman. John Ketley is a weatherman, and so is Michael Fish, and so is Billy Jones, and so
This one, as you see, it has these little ripples on it. One of these little ripples far to the west of us here, Arthur.
Goldfish, I wish, I wish. He was like my goldfish. I wish, I wish, I wish, I wish.
How does it feel to be a honk?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
But just as weather presenters were getting more fun, the weather itself was taking a sinister turn.
The disturbance in the equilibrium of the Antarctic's atmosphere is almost certainly caused by human activity.
There were lots of ideas around and about ways in which man was affecting the environment. Some of that started in the 70s, but certainly in the 80s they became very clear in the public consciousness. So things like ozone depletion and acid rain.
The major cause of acid rain is sulfur dioxide. It can kill trees and poison lakes.
And worse, nuclear fallout felt to many like a genuine threat. When the wind blows was a phrase that took on a whole new dark meaning. The idea took hold that human activity might be destroying the planet. Just as the weather forecasters got less serious, the weather itself seemed to be getting darker and more threatening. No one knew it, but a storm was brewing.
Good afternoon to you. Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
Michael Fish's notorious no hurricane forecast is still remembered 25 years on. Not because he was factually incorrect. He wasn't. There was no hurricane. This was a storm, a very surprising storm that came up from the Bay of Biscay, which hadn't been forecast. His misdemeanor was his tone of voice, because it came across as an expert talking down to the little people, the lay people. And the fact that he was then, as it were, proved wrong by the weather that night showed that the weather is, as it were, not on the side of the experts, it's on the side of the lay people. You know, it was, you know, we got him.
Or had we? The forecasters closed ranks and stood firm on the fact that the weather forecast had been technically correct.
Experts today defended the Met Office. They said it wasn't really their fault. They didn't see what was coming. This type of depression is notoriously difficult to forecast accurately.
If you look at that agonising performance by poor Ian McCaskill the following day, he was unable to say, we got it completely wrong. But under the most intense interrogation, he nearly broke, poor man.
Are you weathermen just shrugging your shoulders as a result of all this, or is there an inquest going on down there at the Weather Centre?
Well, there is at this very minute, and there will be for the next several months. We are getting better and better. This one, just stronger than we thought.
No kidding. I mean, if you can't forecast the worst storms for several centuries 3 hours before they happen, what are you doing?
In the morning.
And now the shipping forecast issued by the Met Office on behalf of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. There are warnings of gales in Fitzroy, Shannon and Rockall.
Well, even though Microfiche did say that there was going to be strong winds on their way, if you'd been listening to the shipping forecast on that night in October 1987, you'd have had a much clearer picture, an unambiguous gale warning, severe gale warning for southern England.
There are warnings of gales in Thames, Dover, Wight, Portland, Plymouth, Biscay, Fitzroy, Sole, Lundy, Fastnet, Irish Sea, Shannon.
The shipping forecast has remained almost exactly the same since the Met Office prepared the first one back in 1924, although there is one notable exception. In 2002, the sea area of Finisterre was renamed Fitzroy, in belated recognition of Robert Fitzroy's founding work at the Met Office.
Shannon, west or northwest 4 or 5, becoming cyclonic gale 8 to storm 10 later.
The forecast, which has a word limit of 350 words, is broadcast every day on Radio 4 longwave at 0048, 0520, 1201 and 1754.
And it has this incredible brevity, incredible concision. Every term used, such as imminently, later, good, have an absolutely precise definition. And once you've learnt what those definitions are, this is the most calibrated way of listening to weather information.
North of 0, south of 0. 40s, chromaty, 4th.
There's a poetry about it, there's a real sense of history about it. The fact it's so unchanging and it's this iron horse of the broadcasting schedule, it's always there.
Time, Dogger, Fisher, German.
Most people who listen to the shipping forecast have no need of it, but it is this kind of national lullaby. It's a walk around the perimeter of the British Isles before bedtime.
Dover, Wight, Portland, Plymouth, Biscay, Trafalgar.
And so we go on that tour, and it stabilises us. But also, of course, it's a tour of places which feel to us dark and unknown. And so, again, we have that extraordinary fusion of a ritual that keeps us calm. It's a lullaby, but at the same time, it reminds us of what is unknowable and frightening and the dark waves which might toss up anything.
Fitzroy, Sole, Lundy, Fastnet, Irish Sea, Shannon, Rockall, Malin.
The shipping forecast is there to save lives, and that's why it has to be there at the same time every day, read in the same way, and can't be shifted in the schedule. So they've really got to be specific and get it right, and it's got to be heard in a way that people in a wheelhouse being washed over by massive waves can still hear it coming through on the crackly radio.
All stations. Weather, occasional rain or drill for a time. Visibility moderate or good. Occasionally poor for a time.
The shipping forecast is still vital for many fishermen up and down the country. Tim Curtis is a Cornish scalloper. He needs to spend 200 days at sea every year if he's to make ends meet.
The scalloping is very weather dependent. We need fine weather. If there's a lot of swell, then our catch rate goes down by half. Anything over force 4, like onshore wind, then we can't go. It's the swell in the water Means the dredges are sort of jumping up and down on the bottom, and we're just wasting fuel then, so it's uneconomic to go. So we work as hard as we can when the weather's fine and stay in when it's poor.
For Tim, the shipping forecast is essential to his business. It can make the difference between a day in the harbour or a dawn heading out into open waters.
We check the weather every day, multiple times a day, and we listen to the Coast Guard reports, we access the internet, television on the boat. Usually we know the day before whether we're going the next day, and then it's a final visual check in the morning before you go.
Viking, North Utsira, South Utsira. Southeasterly 4 or 5, increasing 6 or 7, perhaps gale 8 later, then veering southwesterly 5 or 6. Occasional rain, moderate or good, occasionally poor. 40s.
Bad weather can do more than stop boats going out. Storms have nearly destroyed Polperro Harbour, which Tim works out of. Polperro is tucked away on the Cornish coast. Its very existence is due to the weather, partially shielded from the prevailing southwesterly winds. The community was, and still is, dependent on the sea. Acting harbour master Ollie Puckey keeps a constant watch on the weather.
Everybody involved with the sea listens to the weather forecast. It's like everything stops. You know, the weather's on. You know, drop everything and go and listen to it.
A storm gate protects the harbour, so when the forecast predicts bad weather, the community can act.
This harbour is very exposed and very now reliant on the storm gate we have there. It's surprising how quickly the sea can build up here. In the middle of the night, if the wind does pick up, you know, somebody is there on hand to save the harbour.
Now, the satellite picture sets the scene. It shows the British Isles, in fact, is underneath there somewhere. A lot of cloud and indeed a lot of rain too to the south. Another band of wet weather further north as well.
Despite a freezing start, the 1990s were a mild decade, with the winters 1 degree warmer on average than the winters of the 1960s. The Met Office opened a centre for research into the Earth's climate, just as questions about possible climate change were being raised. In the coming years, sales of sun cream would go through the roof, and worries about global warming engulf previous concerns about acid rain and the ozone layer.
It's very clear that climate is changing and that we have, a lot of confidence that a lot of that change is to do with the release of greenhouse gases by society. What's difficult to know is exactly how they'll change climate and weather on very small scales that really affect people.
Chaos theory had taught meteorologists that the weather was never going to be 100% predictable. Now climate change brought another idea of unpredictability, that the weather might change in all sorts of unknowable ways.
Southwesterly winds, but these northwesterlies already into the West Country, they'll be pushing their way across, bringing clearer weather and colder weather too.
Someone who's been keeping an eye on the volatility of weather is wine producer Bob Lindo. He's been growing grapes for the past 14 years on the lush slopes of his Cornish vineyard.
Vineyards springing up is a sign of global warming in itself. There's no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it. I can tell you that it's a polytunnel warmer here than it was when we started, because when we started we had polytunnels. I can be more than anecdotal. We've analysed the weather data, and we compiled a 10-year rolling average of temperatures over 10 years, and there's a definite increase over 10 years, and has been for 20 years. It's not open to debate. Those figures are recorded, and it's the same everywhere you look in Britain.
But it's still a challenge to grow grapes in the British climate.
Oh, I don't think I'm ever not checking the weather, really. If we get a late frost in Easter time, that wipes the whole year out. Well, only 2 days ago, the forecast really was wall-to-wall sunshine, and suddenly they started to talk about turning colder, and then they start to talk about hints of frost, and then you see on the weather pictures that you're starting to get light winds over the west here, so we could get a night frost. If you get a night frost, that's the end of the ripening. You can still pick the grapes if you pick them all straight away, but you can't ripen them anymore without the leaves. The leaves are the sugar factory.
Bob has learned to encourage extra leaves to grow around the grapes, which act as a blanket and allow the fruit to ripen.
Well, we tried all sorts of ways to conquer the weather, and in the end you tend to try and live with it. I mean, for example, with frosts, we started early on, we got up at night and lit straw bales to try and keep the frost away. That didn't work. And then people will invent magic sprays, and you try them and they don't work. And then we actually bought a machine that was like a flamethrower that put around 100-foot jet of hot, 100-metre jet of hot air. That didn't work. None of these things really work. So it's better to try and go with the weather, with nature, if you like, than it is to try and beat it. The weather really influences the quantity that we're going to get, really. That's the main effect for the weather. In terms of the flavours, really for the vines, even when it's warm, we think it's warm, it's still very cold for the vines. So we still always get these really light, delicate English flavours that you associate with England, like strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, elderflowers, pears, apples. We always get those flavours because it's always cold for the vines.
So this morning then, our band of rain that we've just seen coming in to the west will steadily start to push over towards the east.
The new millennium saw the beginning of weather that seemed difficult to categorise. There were floods, droughts,
it's the same in
and even a tornado.
Across the city. The damage is extreme and localised. Dozens of streets at speeds reaching 130 miles an hour. Little could withstand such power.
Erratic weather was matched by some unusual forecasts, when in 2005, Jeremy Paxman was told to read the weather at the end of Newsnight.
Here it is, shorn of the usual folksy nonsense about clouds bubbling up and advice about wearing woolly socks. Eastern parts will mainly avoid the rain except for those that don't, and there'll be bright or sunny intervals. Western areas will be cloudy with rain except in those places that don't have rain. Temperatures will be near normal.
But the forecasts on Newsnight were soon forgotten when the BBC proudly unveiled their new look weather map, designed to cope with the vagaries of the ever-changing weather.
Fantastic new graphics, just a shame it's the same old weather. The colder air coming in behind this thicker cloud that's in the south. It's giving some light and patchy rain. It's just nudging its way towards the southwest. Here's the clearer skies. You can see the change in colour. That's clearer skies, and with light winds it's going to be really cold.
As we come closer in, this cloud in the south is giving a few spots of rain.
The new three-dimensional animated map was record-breaking. It cost over £1 million to produce, and it drew 4,000 complaints as soon as it appeared.
There seems to be nowhere between Norwich and Manchester. It's like the whole of Middle England doesn't exist.
The new format looks rather like a poor video game, superimposed on a coffee-stained dishcloth.
I don't like the map very much. I think it looks like a bit like Weetabix has been left in the milk too long now.
Indicating that it will be
Not everyone disliked the map, but complaints rained down about the cameras swooping across the country, about the lack of place names. In fact, about every aspect of the new visuals.
The viewing public is very quick to complain and to take notice of any kind of change in how the weather is presented. It's a very comforting ritual, an evening ritual, and people are very upset when this ritual is changed.
Later on in the week. That's it from me.
Darren, thank you very much.
I think there's a collective ownership of the weather, and as a result, we feel like we've got a collective ownership of the weather forecast as well.
But the changes were not just superficial. One of them in particular appeared to some to be politically motivated.
Here in one or two places, that indicates that the cloud will be developing.
A real first for the BBC. National weather with only England and Wales getting predictions. I can't even see what the weather forecast will be for my part of the country. Flatten the map, BBC, and make it a proper forecast.
The map was tilted away from the viewer, making Scotland look about 10 times smaller than England and Wales, when in fact it's half the size.
Angus MacNeil, the SNP MP for the Western Isles, raised questions in the House of Commons and saying that this was, that if it had been tilted the other way, then Barra would look larger than London.
A fortnight after the rebranded weather had appeared, the BBC bowed to pressure and undid some of the changes. Most significantly, it gave Scotland its landmass back.
Rain to come in the north. Fingers crossed for a few sunny spells towards the southeast. And here then, we're looking at a top temperature of 21 or 22.
But forecasting had moved on, and the map had to keep up. These days, the BBC Weather Centre meteorologists have cutting-edge technology to help them compile forecasts for the days ahead.
It's an incredibly complex process. You take millions of observations from around the world, put that into a supercomputer which has got more than 1 million lines of code, doing trillions of calculations. And with all of that, you churn out the forecast that you see on the television. Ultimately, that is the end result.
Duty meteorologist Laura Gilchrist has Met Office technology at her fingertips to help her prepare the television weather maps.
So here is my Met Office computer, which I can use to view weather observations from all around the globe. At the moment, I'm showing a map of the UK, as you can see, and it has overlaid the visible satellite imagery, which we can receive from space. This is how it would look to people on the International Space Station at the moment. So we can see a lot of cloud over here. Overlaying over the top is radar, which is rainfall imagery, and basically that's showing this curl of rain is what we had last night. That's clearing away. There's a few showers around, but both of the radar and the satellite are showing me right now that there's a good deal of really nice weather down in the southwest at the moment, which is going to move across us this afternoon and give us quite a nice day.
The most recent IBM computer they had installed can process 125 billion pieces of information per second. That's more than there are human beings on the planet every second.
Supercomputers have done what humans alone could never do. A 4-day forecast today is as accurate as a 1-day forecast 30 years ago.
In pre-computer days, there was one meteorologist who, as a sort of almost as a joke, calculated that it would require 64,000 people working simultaneously on the data to produce an accurate weather forecast.
Even with all this advanced technology, the weather can still evade the forecaster.
So, remember that barbecue summer we were told to expect? Well, guess what? It's not going to happen. In fact, the Met Office says it never actually promised us one in the first place. They just said we were odds on for hot weather.
Welcome to the barbecue summer at Keswick in the Lake District.
It remains a very imprecise, very inexact science, so that when surprising events happen, as happened in 2012, when a drought that had been predicted to last all summer was immediately followed by the heaviest rains on record, this is beyond the capacity of even the biggest computer.
Recently, a conference was held at the Met Office headquarters in Exeter to discuss this unusual sequence of weather events.
Looking into the future, the weather will become even more varied and potentially even more extreme as well. So you'll have more extremes of rainfall. Already that's happening. If you look at the records, we're getting, say, 4 days of extreme rainfall in a year compared with what was 3 days before. And because the weather is very varied in the UK, perhaps we'll notice those extremes more and they'll have more of an impact.
Every day, over 350 weather reports are broadcast, with the on-duty forecasters having to negotiate this uncertainty. On top of that, they must try and deliver the science in the clearest possible way. Meteorologist Carol Kirkwood has been presenting the weather at the BBC for 20 years.
It's a science, and there's no point going on air talking about sympathetic troughs or PDAs because nobody would know what we were talking about. So what we have to do is translate that meteorological information into everyday language, and if you don't do that, in my opinion, you have failed. There is a level of entertainment in it because you have to keep somebody engaged and somebody watching. If you talk in a monotone voice all the time, like good morning, it's going to be wet and windy today, but it'll be sunny across Northern Ireland, you know, it's like, what happened there? I get accused a lot of smiling, but I can't help it because I love my job. I don't deliberately set out to smile. I will at the beginning and the end, But when I'm doing it, it's enthusiasm, it's our subject, it's meteorology. We're fascinated by it as well. So you try and deliver it in the best form that is appropriate for that weather. And you can see temperature-wise, again, that cool feel coming across Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, but still, in comparison, relatively mild in the southeast.
Expectations are high. There's enormous pressure on the Met Office to get the forecasts right, and on the weather presenters to communicate them clearly and concisely.
The weird thing about weather forecasting is it has a language all of its own. Forecasters on a daily basis use expressions that are never used in any other walk of life. Thunder only ever comes in odd rumbles.
And as with all things weather-related, people like complaining about it.
Sometimes I laugh with the ridiculous phrases that are used. I could give you some examples.
Cloud bubbling up, for instance. Bits and pieces of rain.
We'll have a weather front sitting down. We are going to have a sandwich of weather today. A little ribbon of cloud flirting with the southwest.
Sharp showers. Why are showers? Why should showers be sharp? You know, knives are sharp.
A squally band moving currently through Kent, Essex and Suffolk.
It's always been true that weather forecasters must cater for a large and varied audience. Pleasing all the people all of the time is no easy matter.
So you certainly can't describe the weather as dull over the next couple of days, Charlie and Susanna.
It'll keep us interested then, Carol, even as we get wet.
Certainly will.
Thanks very much.
This ambiguity of tone between being a scientist on the one hand and being a television personality on the other, this has been an issue over the last 60 years.
With the weather becoming more extreme, the forecast is more important than ever, especially in places that are vulnerable to the elements.
All the way, you'll notice the isobars, especially further south, start to slacken, so it's not going to be as windy through the afternoon.
5 gusts 7 from the west.
At the Forth Road Bridge on the east coast of Scotland, maintenance supervisor George Hamilton is always worrying about the conditions.
As far as my job's concerned, I live with the weather. As soon as I get in, the first thing I do is get a weather report. Tommy, could you give me a wind speed and direction, please?
5 gusts 7 from the west.
Now, I've seen myself out there with the boys working, and all of a sudden you can actually see it coming from the west, the black cloud and the wind. And you don't have much time to get off. The wind just catches you, so you've got to be very aware, if you like, you know.
High winds affect the road traffic too. The weather at the bridge is monitored 24 hours a day from the control centre, and speed restrictions are put in place if winds become too strong. But not everyone heeds those warnings.
In extreme wind conditions, if you look out there at the midspan, it can actually go east to west between 6 metres and 7 metres. When that's an awful lot of movement and things like that, the bridge would be closed in that.
Every day, George is utterly reliant on the weather forecast.
Every morning I listen to Carol Kirkwood on BBC, and you know, she's my queen, you know. So I've got to listen to her before I come out in the morning, you know. I listen to everything she tells us because she's pretty good, you know.
The Forth Road Bridge is very high maintenance. Every inch needs to be constantly checked and weatherproofed.
You're always thinking about the weather. At the moment I've got the painters, you can look at the suspender wires that's holding the bridge up. We're painting them. We need the weather for that, and we need the wind. The rain's no good. And that's ongoing. It'll take us about 6 years to finish that, but as soon as we're finished that, we're back at the first one again, because you get quite a bit of corrosion. So it's ongoing. It's never ending, you know. I hate the weather.
Over the last 60 years, weather forecasting has gone from this to this. Perfect predictions are a dream we persist with, despite all the evidence that they will never be possible.
Oh no! We all now consume weather forecast information on our phones. We all use apps and we all expect those weather apps to tell us that whether it's going to rain for us in the exact location that we are. Whether we can really do it down to the postcode scale that people expect, I think is probably a matter for debate, and probably we can't right now. But I think that's probably where weather forecasting is going, to this very kind of hyper-local idea.
For all the gadgets and new technologies, many still want some human engagement. Watching the weather forecast is a daily ritual for millions.
There's some interesting social science research recently which showed that huge numbers of people watch the weather forecast after the news, but when interviewed afterwards, most of them, about 70% of them, couldn't remember at all what was said about the weather. They were allowing it to sort of glide over them as a kind of national conversation about the weather.
And part of the national conversation about the weather will always be about problems with the forecast.
I'm quite reassured, in a way, that the weather forecast is wrong, because it means there are still mysteries. The meteorologists today will be the first to admit we can't control it. We can predict it to the best of our abilities, but the default position is we don't know what it's going to do. This is the best we can do, and I think that's very healthy.
It's important to remember that the weather forecast is a triumph of technology in a science still very much in its infancy.
I think our forecasting skills are going to become even better than they currently are with the evolution of technology and the information available to us, the satellites that we have orbiting the Earth. It can only get better. The computers are getting faster and faster all the time, as is the knowledge that we have about our climate.
The weather forecast has become a touchstone, a moment of calm in our stormy, uncertain times.
I think our relationship with the weather triggers all our fears about flux and chaos, and because of that triggers our deepest investment in ordering, in ritual, in trying to tell the future. And the weather forecast, just those few minutes after the news, somehow manages to condense all of that into our daily lives.